What's up, guys? How's it going? My name is John. I come from a company called Japanese Knife Imports. I feel like the name kind of says exactly what we do, so sweet. Today, we're going to go over knife sharpening with you guys. I've been doing this for a long time. Before I did this, I cooked professionally for a long time. I'm pretty dorky about this stuff. And over the years, what I have found is this. Once the fundamental concepts make sense, once you understand like what's going on, how it all works, why it works that way, what potential pitfalls are, like how to look for them, how to understand them, what to do about them. The rest is actually pretty easy. It's just a function of like muscle memory and getting in those man hours of practice. And so that's our goal today. Today, my goal is to impart upon you, the fundamental concepts of sharpening and show you what mistakes look like, how to recognize them, what to do about them, so that when you go about sharpening, instead of just kind of randomly doing it, hoping that you'll get good results, now you can do it with critical thinking and intention so that you get consistent good results, because consistency is the name of the game for anyone that works in kitchens, for sure. In front of you, there is a little packet and also my card, because if you have questions, you can just email or call. Our store is like 10 minutes from here. We're on Wilshire in between Robertson and La Cienega. I don't want to say it's walking distance, but like if you're aggressively walking, you could probably make that work. But we're around. So if you have questions about whatever we discuss here, or you go out and you're doing some stuff with your knives and something comes up, email us, call us, come in, hang out, ask questions. We're here to make sure that we can help you out with that kind of stuff. Today, we're going to focus on the sharpening of double bevel knives specifically. And there are different kinds of knives out there. Double bevel and single bevel knives are the two main kinds of things that you will see. And they look really different, and it's pretty easy to tell. I think a lot of people get confused. You hear these terms when you go shopping for things, and you're like, what does it mean? No one really spends the time to explain it. So today, we're going to go over that. Double bevel knives look something like this. And they can be in a wide variety of shapes, but the most important thing is that they look pretty much the same on either side of the blade. Now the bevel, that little like edge part, might be larger or smaller on one side than the other, but if you look at the knife and this pretty much looks the same as this, that is generally a double bevel knife. If you pick up a knife and one side looks just drastically different from the other side, that is likely a single bevel knife. And the way that they are used and the way that they are sharpened is going to be very different from double bevel knives. Because single bevel knives are much more specialized in what they do, it's not likely that's going to be like your day-to-day knife that you use. But if you do use them and you have questions about sharpening, care, maintenance, technique, whatever, let me know and I will try and touch upon that. Today, I just want to focus on the double bevel knives as much as possible, because that is likely what you are using in your day-to-day knife work. So that's like your chef's knife, utility knife, slicer, gyuto, tsujihiki, peti, santoku, whatever they might be. Those are the bulk of the knives that we are using. So that is the difference between the double bevel and single bevel. I think that's pretty straightforward. As we go through this, we're going to cover first the fundamental concepts of sharpening. Then I'm going to try and demonstrate all of those things to you so you can see all of the things that we talked about. We're going to go over what all the mistakes you can make are. I'm going to show you what those mistakes look like, not only in making them, but also in what the end result of those mistakes is, how to fix them. And then at the end, we'll try and have some time for any kind of like one-on-one questions you have, or if you have knives that you have problems with, bring them over, let's take a look, and we'll try and problem solve that stuff together. So, the basic kinds of double bevel knives that exist, as I mentioned, you'll see like a chef's knife, which in Japanese we would call a gyuto. Slicer would be a tsujihiki. Santoku is like a smaller all-purpose chef's knife, and a lot of people use them nowadays, but what they are is really geared towards home kitchens in Japan. So you'll see that they're generally a much smaller size, and that ends up being limiting in terms of the size and quantity of ingredients you can work with. So being in a professional kitchen, your job is to take big things and make them small and then make them fancy and taste good. And in order to do so, you need a knife that is large enough to allow you to work with those larger size ingredients like whole heads of cabbage and like subprimal cuts and stuff like that, and break them down into smaller pieces, and then do so in large quantities. I remember in one of my first jobs ever, one of the guys I worked with, Chavez, he would get through stuff like 2 to 3 times faster than me, and I could never figure it out because he was like 30 years older than me and kind of slow. But every time I was cutting an onion, he was cutting 3. And he just had this like massive 12-inch chef's knife, and he just blasted through stuff. So if we were cutting up Merois, like literally his job was done 3 times faster than mine. And it really made me think about the tools that I was using and what would be most effective for the job. During prep, one thing is going to be appropriate. During service, another thing is going to be appropriate. So during prep, big knives are great. They allow you to work with large size ingredients, and you got to get comfortable with that stuff. You wouldn't walk into a kitchen and be like, I don't feel comfortable on a French top, so I'm just not going to do that. Like, you pick it up, you learn how to use it. During service, you want something a little bit smaller, usually 8 inches, 210 millimeters or so, where it gives you enough length to slice through single portions of things, cut things in half, mince stuff, but also so it stays out of the way, so you have enough space to plate. Because that's the job. You slice single portions of things, you cut stuff in half, and then you put it on a plate. So those are the main kinds of double bevel knives you'll end up seeing. When do you sharpen your knife? Well, when it's not cutting the way you want. There's not any kind of objective thing that you can look at and say, oh, I have to sharpen my knife every 2 days, or every 5 days, or every 6.25 hours. You're going to have to be mindful and introspective and say, how are things working for me? Is my knife working the way that I want, or is it not? When I use it, does it cut the way I want or not? When it no longer works the way you want, that's usually the best time to sharpen. However, what I used to do when I was cooking, because I was super dorky about this stuff, is I sharpened much more regularly. I had a whole system worked out where I would sharpen on a really regular basis. And because I was doing it so frequently, I had a consistent level of performance from my knife. So I knew like anytime I picked up my knife, it was going to work the same way as any other time I picked up my knife. If you spread out the time that you sharpen in a pretty significant way, you're going to see that your knife is sharp and it degrades, and by the time you get ready to sharpen it, it's in pretty bad shape. So the cutting that you're doing doesn't feel the same as the cutting that you'll be doing when it's freshly sharp. And that means you have to adjust the way that you do things in order to get stuff to work. So if you can maintain a consistent level of performance, I think that helps out with just focusing on developing your skill better, but also maintaining consistency in the kind of work that you do. So, yeah, when it doesn't cut the way you want, that is usually when you want to sharpen. Tomatoes are often like a good test. Like if you can't cut a tomato, you're probably fucking something up somewhere along the way there. So that usually works pretty well. Before we start sharpening, one of the things we're going to have to do is inspect our knife so we know what's going on with it, what problems there might be, and make sure that we're starting from a place that's going to help us get good results. So inspecting a knife isn't just simply about like looking at it and seeing where there's damage or how large the bevel is or that kind of stuff. We also want to make sure the knife is straight. We want to make sure that there aren't any kind of issues that exist in the knife that are going to be exacerbated by any of the sharpening that we do. So the way that we're going to inspect our knife is this. First, we're going to look at the edge. We're going to see, does the bevel look consistent and even in size? Is there chipping? Is there damage? How large is the bevel? Does it look the same on one side versus the other? Are there facets to it, or is it like a nice, clean plane? What's going on with it, right? So we're going to identify any problems we see there so we know what we're going to be focusing on as we sharpen. Then we're going to look and see how thick or thin our knife is behind the edge. When you cut, the most important thing about cutting performance is cross-sectional geometry. So that's how thick or thin your knife is and how it tapers from spine to edge. And the reason that matters the most is because physics matters the most. You have to displace material when you cut. And so you want to displace that material for as little of a distance as possible, and you want to extend the period of time over which that displacement occurs for as long as possible, because that means you use the least amount of force to cut. So thinner knives and knives that stay thinner longer will generally cut better. But as you sharpen your knife over time, will get thicker and thicker behind the edge, and so you want to see, is my knife thick behind the edge? Is it thin behind the edge? How much work do I need to do to that, right? So you can do that by pinching the blade and running your fingers off the side, feeling it. You can feel how thick it is, but you can also look at it like this and try and focus on this area here to see how thick or thin it is. Next, we want to look for straightness, and we're going to look for straightness in a number of ways. But if there's a bend in your blade and you start sharpening, the part that's bent out towards the stone is going to be sharpened a lot more, and that can change the profile of your blade over time. So for example, if the blade is bent like this and I'm sharpening, this area that juts out is going to dip in a little bit more, and you're going to have a dip in your edge from that. So you want to make sure that your blade is straight to start with. And so what you're going to do is you're going to look down the spine. So you're going to line up with one eye, and then you're going to kind of shift your focus all the way along the spine here, and then you're going to do so from the edge this way, kind of shifting your focus all the way up as you go. And then you do the same thing with the tip facing towards you, the edge facing up this way. And you can look and see if there are straighten issues. If there are bends, you want to fix that. That's not something I would recommend doing on your own, but it is something that we do pretty regularly. And in fact, we have a tool like this that allows us then to bend things back into place as we go. You definitely want to start from a straight place. Blades can also have not just left-right bending, but they can have warping or twisting, and so you want to look for that as well. And one of the ways that we'll do that is we'll hold it up here, and we'll try and line the edge up in the center of where the spine would be, and then you can see, does the edge kind of come up or dip below where the spine would be? And that would be indicative of some kind of twisting like this. And again, that's something you'd want to fix before you start sharpening, but not necessarily something that I would recommend doing on your own until you get super dorky about knives and you have a lot more experience with this stuff. But that's definitely the place you want to start. You want to look and see what are the problems that are going on. What am I going to need to do to formulate a game plan that will work effectively for me to get the knife to work the way I want. There's no like single right way to sharpen it. In fact, what I'm going to show you today is just like one way that you can sharpen. There are many ways that you can sharpen, and as long as they hit these basic points that we're going to cover today, you're good. But that means that you want to be mindful and think about like how do I want my knife to work? What am I looking for performance-wise? What am I looking for results-wise? And then find some kind of game plan that enacts that best. So it's not that there's like some objective best like level of sharpness that you need or some kind of edge that's like the best. There will be edges that will work better for certain tasks or edges that will work better for certain people, and you'll have to figure out how that works for you. Which brings me to the next point, which is what kind of stones do you need to be able to sharpen? The bare minimum that you need is some kind of medium grit stone, something to hold it in place and something to keep it flat. Something to hold it in place and something to keep it flat are just necessary no matter what you do, but they can range from like totally free to stupidly expensive, and it's going to be a function of budget relative to convenience. On the really free side of things, a damp towel on your countertop is really effective for holding stuff in place. Cabinet liner works pretty well. Paper towels, totally fine. The purpose is to stop stuff from sliding around so you have a nice stable stone. It's not sliding all over the place. And ideally, you want to position yourself in an area where you have knuckle clearance. So for example, I would work near the edge of my counter like this so my knuckles overhang the floor instead of the table, or that they provide some height so that as I sharpen here like this setup does, provides height so my knuckles overhang nothing instead of rubbing on the table. So you need something to hold it in place. Keeping the stone flat is also necessary. I'm sure anyone that's ever been in a kitchen before has seen a stone that looks like a half pipe because no one ever flattens that shit. You cannot maintain a consistent angle on those things. It's very difficult to dynamically adjust your angle as you go. So it's really important that we keep nice flat surfaces on our stones. And there are, again, a number of ways that you can do that. I have flattened stones on sidewalks outside or on the stairs leading into the kitchen that I worked in before. You just need like a coarse surface you can rub stuff on. Nowadays, I use diamond flattening plates, and it's just like an aluminum plate with diamonds on one side of it, and that's like the bougiest of ways that one can do this, but it's really fast. Again, convenience relative to budget. There are all kinds of stone fixers out there. You just want to make sure that whatever you're using, when you start on it, that surface is nice and flat so that you can maintain a consistent angle easily on that kind of thing. Medium grit stones will be anywhere between 800 and 2000 grit. Like sandpaper, the higher the number, the finer the abrasive, so the smaller the abrasive size. Medium grit stones should be fast enough to get rid of minor chips and nicks and leave you with an edge that's fine for any kind of normal kitchen use you want to do. So the bare minimum you need, medium grit stone, something to hold it in place and something to keep it flat. If you have like a complete sharpening setup, like money is no object, you can do everything you want to do, you will have 5 things. So you'll have a coarse stone, a medium stone, a finishing stone, something to hold it in place and something to keep it flat. You don't need more than that. Some people get really dorky with it and have all kinds of other shit. That's really all you need. Coarse stones will be anything under 800 grit. Usually for people, that's somewhere around 300 to 400 grit. The benefit of a coarse stone is it speeds up the sharpening process. So instead of taking a long ass time on that medium grit stone, you can get stuff done significantly faster and move through your sharpening progression. That means that making major repairs is much easier. Bigger chips, nicks, stuff like that, you can get out much more quickly. And as you get better at sharpening, you can just use that to speed up the sharpening process. We'll touch on thinning in a little bit, but it makes the process of thinning significantly easier as well. The downside of coarse stones is that every mistake that you make will show up much more quickly and in a much more severe manner. So until you feel comfortable with your sharpening, that's not always the best place to be because it's possible to make some serious mistakes in your sharpening, and or the thing that I see most common in professional kitchens is just like unnecessary sharpening, like sharpening without knowing what results you're looking for and just wasting metal. So all the time you have knives that just like cycle through. You buy like a new knife every year or so. So you want to avoid doing that as much as possible. But they do definitely speed up sharpening and can be extremely useful. The medium grit stone we already touched on, and then finishing stones will be anything above 3,000 grit. Usually for kitchen knives, I'll recommend people stay somewhere between 3,000 and 8,000 grit. And the idea behind a finishing stone is that it provides more refinement from your edge. So if you work with ingredients that are maybe plated or served raw or delicate ingredients, you want to cause less damage to them, finishing stones will yield keener edges that are much, much finer. And so when you slice, for example, like a crudo or carpaccio or something like that, the cut surface ends up being like smooth and glossy, whereas like coarser finishes end up yielding kind of a more matte texture. You get less water loss. It looks prettier. It definitely feels better. The additional benefits of it, aside from just like feeling sharper, are that it makes the process of burr removal a lot easier. So as we sharpen, we're going to go through this process of forming and then removing a burr, which I will touch on in a little bit. It is much easier to do that on a finishing stone because they are slower and less aggressive, but you just can't use that for the bulk of your sharpening because it is slower. They're also really great for touching up. So if you have the ability to have a finishing stone somewhere nearby, like I used to keep one in the third pan near my station, I would use that in lieu of a honing rod to touch up my knife throughout the day. And that edge lasted longer and there was less damage to my knife as a function of doing that kind of thing. And again, that helped me keep a more consistent level of performance as I was working. So core stone, medium grit stone, finishing stone, some to hold it in place and some to keep it flat. You don't have to spend a lot of money on stones. In fact, starting simple is better. It forces you to focus on the skill and technique of sharpening instead of buying fancy shit that kind of covers up a lack of skill and technique. So I would recommend whenever you do this, just start nice and simple. There are 3 kinds of sharpening stones out there. And this is about the way that they're manufactured. So stones are usually some kind of binding agent and some kind of abrasive mixed together, like making dough. There are going to be ceramic stones, resinoid-based stones, and magnesia-based stones. And they all have kind of slightly different performance components, performance aspects, and also care requirements. Ceramic stones are the most common that you see, and those need to be soaked prior to use. And when you put them in water, you just leave them in there until bubbles stop coming out. It's usually about 5-10 minutes. Once they are fully saturated, you're good to use them. You can take them out, dry them, do whatever. The plus side of ceramic stones is that they provide really good tactile feedback. They're very grippy, but they need to be soaked prior to use, so you have to figure out, do I have time for that shit or not? Magnesia-based stones are the polar opposite. Magnesia-based stones, like this one here, do not require any soaking at all. So I can just splash water on this, and I'm ready to go. And when I'm done, I wipe it off, keep it dry. The downside of magnesia-based stones is they tend to be harder, and they tend to feel a little bit more slippery, so you don't get the same kind of tactile feedback from them. And also, if you leave them soaking in water, they will start to fall apart. They'll start to develop spiderweb cracking and just kind of crumble on you. So you need to be really cognizant of what kind of stone you have and know how to deal with it. And if you're not sure what kind of stone you have, ask the person you bought it from or bug me. I've used every fucking stone on the market at this point, and I can probably answer those questions. Resinoid-based stones are also often billed as splash and go stones in the sense that you should just be able to splash water on them and sharpen, but they actually work best when they're permanently soaked. The binding agent soaks in water, and as it does, it kind of swells and softens. And because it's softer, as you're sharpening, the binding agent wears away and it releases more fresh abrasive, so it tends to cut quicker. They tend to have like a creamier tactile feel, and they do a better job at polishing. So if you're looking at finishing stones, you want like a really shiny, smooth-looking edge. You're trying to make shit look really nice. Resinoid-based stones work really well for that. However, soaking and drying them repeatedly causes them to crack. So those are ones that you need to leave in water permanently or just use as splash and go stones. So those are the main kinds of stones that you'll see. As I mentioned before, we'll have a number of stone fixers out there. The diamond stone fixers are the ones that I like to use the most because they always stay flat and they're very fast, but they cost more money and they don't last as long. You can also find big stone-based fixers. They're usually rather coarse, like 100 grit, 120 grit. And those work well, but they don't cut quite as quickly, and they also need to be flattened periodically. You'll see them ranging from like, $15, $20 up to, I've seen diamond flattening plates for like $400. This one's like $55. It's not too bad. Honing steels. Do most of you guys use Japanese knives? Or are you guys using like German knives? Is there a mix of stuff? Where do you guys stand on that spectrum?
Mixture, but Japanese is probably mainly everybody's in this kitchen.
So most people are using some kind of Japanese knife in here? Cool. Japanese knives, they're a lot thinner and harder than their Western counterparts. And so that's why they work well. Like the thinner the shit is, the better it moves through food, and the harder it is, the longer it stays sharp. But it also means they're much more fragile or brittle. And so the use of a honing rod doesn't work as well. Honing rods are designed to realign edges that have come out of alignment. That works when the steel is soft and it has room for elastic and plastic deformation. So whenever you exert pressure against any material, it will go through these various stages. Initially, what you'll see is elastic deformation. That means the material will bend and then pop back into place. And when you cross the materials threshold for that, you'll get into plastic deformation. That's where things bend and stay bent. And then beyond that, fracturing. Because they're thinner and harder, their room for elastic and plastic deformation is much more narrow, and they go into that fracturing range much more quickly. So that's why they chip more easily, and that's why if you use like an aggressive honing rod on them, you'll see like a little bit of edge damage as you go. So with Japanese knives, you want to avoid using honing rods as much as possible. And in fact, it speaks to like some of the techniques that you want to avoid when you're cutting with them so you don't cause damage. So you want to avoid hitting really hard things because the impact occurs really quickly and is unforgiving, and so they will chip. You want to avoid hitting things with excessive force. Again, impact time is really short, so there's not a lot of time for pressure to dissipate. But most importantly, you want to avoid lateral force exerted across the edge, like any pressure coming from the side across the edge. And that's like twisting, rotating, side-to-side movements, especially while cutting tall, dense foods. The thinner and harder your knife is, the more likely it is to chip. It's also why rocking motions don't work as well for Japanese knives because the tip stays in contact with your board as you move laterally across stuff. So instead of a rocking motion, you can use kind of a thrust cutting motion where you're kind of lifting up this way and coming back down this way, and the entire knife is coming off the board. You can still chop things, you can still dice things pretty well, but this way the edge isn't in contact as you're moving laterally across foods. And you do so with a loose grip, so as you lift up, the tip will drop down, and as you come down, the tip will hit first, and you just continue until the heel makes contact so you don't have accordion cuts. And if you want to like mince up parsley, right, you like roll it up, shift knot it, and then rotate the bunch and shift knot, and then you have like nice consistent pieces, and you haven't fucked up your knife. So lateral force is no good. So if you can avoid using honing rods, avoid using honing rods. And in lieu of that, you'll use a finishing stone in a motion called a stropping motion, which I'll show you in a little bit. If your knife is on the softer side of stuff, or you have German knives, something that's a little bit more forgiving, you can get away using a honing rod. But when you do so, you want to do it with good technique. And a lot of people do stuff like up in the air like this. It's very difficult because you have multiple moving parts and you can't control pressure or angle as easily. So the better thing to do is to take a kitchen towel, put the tip of that thing down, and then run it like this, where you have much better control over the angle. You can see what angle you're doing stuff, and you can control the pressure a little bit better because you only have one moving part there. Try to avoid them if you can, but if you can't, it is what it is. All right, body positioning. The body positioning that we're going to use for sharpening is really similar to the body positioning you want to use for cutting, and it's going to look something like this. I'm going to stand over here so y'all can see. So instead of squaring off with your cutting board, like this, like imagine my cutting board is in front of me, I'm going to take a step back with my right foot if I'm right-handed, or my left foot if I'm left-handed, and it's going to shift my body to the side. And in doing so, say I'm cutting. Instead of my work area being here, my work area is going to shift to this lower right-hand corner of my board, or lower left-hand corner of my board, and that means now my knuckles overhang the floor instead of overhanging the board. I have much better range of motion with my arm. I can look down on my cut thickness and gauge that without being off balance, so there's much greater range of motion in doing things this way. We're going to use a really similar body positioning for sharpening. So as I get ready to do my sharpening, I'm going to square off with this, and I'm going to take a step back with my foot just a little bit, so my feet are placed kind of like this. And again, that's going to give me the range of motion for what I'm looking to do here as I go through my sharpening. For the grips, we're going to start off from a pinch grip. I don't know why I have to go over this so much, but there's always someone in the kitchen that just doesn't know what a pinch grip is, but they think they do, and they're like, I don't know, back here or something. You are going to use the first knuckle of your index finger and the pad of your thumb, and you're going to pinch way up here on the blade, all the way up here on the blade, not behind here, way up here. Your middle finger is going to go down into this area here, and your last two fingers are just going to lightly wrap around the handle. So your grip is here. This provides kind of like rotational control, and these are just so that out of the way. You don't really have a lot of force in there. And in fact, your grip should be pretty loose and relaxed. If you have like a Kung Fu death grip on your knife, your cutting is going to suffer from that. And also you'll have like really bad arthritic pain, but mostly your cutting will suffer from that. So you want to try and be loose and relaxed as you do stuff. So this is the main grip that we're going to start from as we figure out the grips we're going to use for our sharpening. When we sharpen the first side of our knife, I'm going to sharpen the right side. Is there any left-handed person in here, by the way? Anyone? Anyone? All right, cool. So I'm just going to focus on right-handed sharpening. It's going to make my life a lot easier. For sharpening the right side of the knife first, we're going to start from the pinch grip. We're going to move our index finger up to the spine and our thumb down towards the heel. So it's going to look kind of like this. As I mentioned before, my angle of approach is going to be this kind of like 45-degree angle approach. I'm going to put my knife down here on the blade. My angle of approach with the knife, and when I say angle of approach, I mean this kind of angle, not this kind of angle, right? This is going to be somewhere in like the 45 to 60 degree range of things. So I get much more contact with my stone this way than I do if it's perpendicular, right? I have much more surface area that I'm contacting. It's much more comfortable for my wrist to be like this than it is like this. And also, my motion for sharpening is going to be straight forward and straight back. And in doing so, the way the knife wobbles will have an offset from the way that I'm moving. So if I hold the knife like this and I move like this, it wobbles in the same direction I'm moving. But if I hold the knife like this, it's a little bit easier to maintain a consistent angle. So I have my grip like this, and I'm going to put 2 to 3 fingers down as close to the edge as possible. I'm going to try and keep this hand in the center line of the stone so that I'm applying pressure evenly over the stone. I'm not off to the side over here, over here. And I'm going to move straight forward, straight back. So this is what our sharpening motion is going to look like. And as I go up, I can either crawl my fingers up if you feel comfortable kind of crawling them up as you go, or you can stop, move your fingers over a little bit, and go. You're not going to lift up the knife in between those kind of adjustments as you go. So that's the first grip I'm going to use. When I sharpen the second side of the knife, I'm going to again start from a pinch grip, but this time I'm going to move my thumb up to the spine and my index finger down towards the heel like this. And here it's not possible to have that same angle of approach initially as I once did because the handle will get in the way. So I have to start off perpendicular, but I can move back into that angle of approach as I go down the blade. Otherwise, it's the same. Straight forward, straight back, crawling my fingers up, or doing a little bit, stopping, moving, doing a little bit, stopping, moving. So those are the main grips that we are using. In terms of the angle of sharpening, and when I say angle of sharpening, I mean now specifically this angle. There's not one right answer. It's not like 15 degrees per side is the way to sharpen all knives, or like this one needs 10 degrees, that one needs 18 degrees. Rather, you want to understand what those angles mean, and then you want to figure out what's going to work well for you, for your knife, for the task at hand. And so the gist of it is this. The more acute the angle is, so the overall angle being more acute or smaller overall, The sharper the knife will feel, but the more fragile the brittle it's going to be. The less acute that you go, the less sharp it's going to feel, but the more tough and durable it's going to be. So if you have your knife chipping on you all the time, sharpen a little bit less acute. If you need something that feels a little bit sharper, gives you a little bit better performance, sharpen a little bit more acute. And you have to figure out how that works for you, your cutting style, your cutting boards, the knife you have, so on and so forth. There are safe bet ranges for certain kinds of knives. So like for most double bevel Japanese knives, you want to be somewhere between 10 and 15 degrees per side. For German knives, it can be a little bit higher than that, maybe like 15 to 20 degrees per side. But again, it's not that there's one right answer, and you can be outside of that range if you feel comfortable with that. There are a few ways to figure out what those angles look like. You can kind of eyeball it, knowing like 90, 45, 22.5, 11.125. That works pretty well for eyeballing stuff, but you can also just use your smartphone, and there's an app for it. On the iPhone, it is in the Measure app, and when you go to the Measure app, click the level thing at the bottom, and it's got this fancy little horizon thing that you can use for hanging photos, but you can also put it down on something, tap the screen to zero it out, and then as you lift up, you can see what the angle is. So I can do that on my stone surface, and I can see what angles are to kind of eyeball that. It's not important that you're like so specific with the angle. Like if you choose 12 degrees, you have to be exactly at 12 degrees. Get close, but be consistent in what you do, and then use your knife. See how it works. Figure out what's going on. If you need to make an adjustment, next time relative to what you've done before, you a little bit more acute or a little bit less acute. But again, there's not a right answer. You just need to be mindful and introspective as you work so you can get stuff to work the way that you want. Does that make sense so far? I know I'm going really fast through things. We're just trying to get through this in like a reasonable time for y'all, and I speak quickly anyways. But if there are questions that you guys have, like feel free to stop me. But like I said, we're going to have this up on YouTube, so you'll be able to reference this later on anyways. And you can also just hit me up with questions. That's the angle of sharpening and angles of approach. Sometimes there will be asymmetry with knives. You'll see like on Japanese knives, one side of the knife will have a larger bevel than the other side of the knife. And oftentimes retail shops will express these in ratios. They'll say this is a 50-50 knife, meaning it's like roughly equal, or like a 70-30, meaning that like one side is bigger than the other. I was very confused about this for a long time because surface level, it sounds good. You're like, oh yeah, that side is bigger than that side. But in reality, it's very tough to understand what that means. Is it the amount of time you spend sharpening on either side, or are the angles the same, are they different? You know, what's going on with it? And I came to realize it was much like what happened to me when I was still cooking professionally, and everyone would always ask me how to cook shit. Like, how do you cook a steak? And the answer is kind of complicated, right? You want to know, like, what kind of steak is it? Was it tempered? Like, how are you trying to cook the thing? But really, like, all people want is like 5 minutes per side and stick it in the oven until it's the temp you want and make sure you rest it. And like, it works. Like, it, you know, explains shit, and like probably people will be okay with it, but it's not a complete answer. Now I get to hang out with craftsmen in Japan and just speak to them about these things. And in asking them, one of them made fun of me for it, but he said, like, have you ever seen us measure the angles that we sharpen it? Have you ever seen us count the number of strokes that we do? I'd never seen them do it. And so he tried to explain to me the best way to think about it. And what he explained was this. When you have your knife, cut some shit with it. See what happens. Does it steer to the side? Does it steer to the other side? Does it cut straight? Based on that, you can figure out what you want to do with it. The sides of knives may not always be ground equally. One side may be more convex, one side may be flatter. The edges may not be ground equally, but you can figure out what's going on just by using it and seeing. If it steers to one side, that means it's exerting more pressure on one side than the other. And that means you want to create more surface area on the side that it's steering towards to get it to exert more pressure in that direction and cut straight. And you can do that by adjusting the amount of time you spend sharpening on either side, the angle that you sharpen on either side, or a combination thereof. And as soon as you start to play around with the angle, you just have to remember the more acute that you go overall, the sharper it will feel, but the more fragile or brittle it will be. The less acute you go, the more tough and durable, but the less sharp it will feel. And so as long as you can pay attention to those things, you can use your knife, see what's going on with it, figure out how you want it to work, and then come up with a game plan that does that effectively for you. If you have knives that are clad, that means they have like soft steel on the outside and like a hard core steel. You also want to be cognizant of where the apex of the edge is, like where the center of the edge is. You don't want it to drift so far off to the side because eventually the cladding will become the edge, and then you've spent all this money for this fancy steel that you're not using. So in those cases, you want to try and be also cognizant of where that lies in your knife. Make sense? You guys are with me on this so far? All right, cool. So of the images that I have in front of you, the first really poorly drawn image, I apologize for my shitty art skills, by the way. The first really poorly drawn image is this one here, and it looks kind of like this. And the idea is this. When you start sharpening, you're sharpening from a place where the edge is dull, right? It's not sharp at all. It's kind of rounded over. It might be chipped. This is where we want to start from. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to sharpen on whatever our first stone is, and we're going to form a burr. A burr is this little piece of red that's over here, right? And it's a little piece of metal that will flip over to the opposite side that we sharpen. So if I have a knife and I'm sharpening this side, metal has really strong covalent bonds, likes to stay connected to itself. A little bit of the metal will be ground away, and some of the metal will flip over to the opposite side that we have here. And this little bit here, this is called a burr. And a burr is really important because it gives us some feedback that we can work with. One, it tells us that we've actually sharpened the edge of our knife. We're not doing like the area behind it or anything like that. We actually hit the edge, which is kind of important in getting the knife sharp. Two, it tells me that I've removed fatigue steel and I've exposed fresh new steel that's going to hold up. So as you use your knife, you're banging it against cutting board, food, whatever, metal becomes fatigued and it stops wanting to hold an edge for as long. We want to make sure that we're getting rid of that metal and exposing fresh new metal that will stay sharp for a long period of time. Three, I want to make sure that the burr, that little floppy piece of metal, is consistent and even in size from heel to tip, and we're going to feel for that. And that tells me that I'm removing the same amount of metal at each place along the blade so that my knife stays the consistent shape over time. If you have a big burr in one area and a small burr in another area, that means you're removing more metal in one area than another, and the shape of your knife is going to change. Now, if you want to do that, cool, that's an intentional thing. If you don't want to do that, you have to pay attention to this kind of stuff so you don't mess it up in that way. So once we sharpen the first side, we go through and we do the second side. You'll see that the burr has switched sides, so it's not going to exist on both sides at the same time. It will be on one side, and then it will be on the other side. And so as we go through this setup, we're going to do it like this. We're going to do coarse, coarse, medium, medium, fine, fine. You go through your progression back and forth on each side. And as you do that, you're going to look at the scratch pattern on your edge. You're going to see, does this look like the scratch pattern that I expect from the stone? So like the higher up you go, the shinier it will be, the smaller the scratches will be, until we get to the end. And when we get to the end, we have this little burr hanging off the edge, and we need to do some additional steps to get rid of that burr to get a nice, clean, stable, sharp edge. So the burr actually might feel really sharp. You might be able to like shave hair and cut paper and do all kinds of fun tricks, but it's not going to stay sharp for a long period of time. The second it hits a cutting board, it's going to roll over, it's going to fail. The second you use it on food, it's going to get messed up. So what we're going to do then is we're going to go through first weakening of the burr's connection to the edge, making it as small as possible, and then removing it. And one of the ways we do that is a stropping motion. So have you ever seen any barbers with the leather and the straight razor doing this kind of stuff to it? This motion is called stropping. And stropping is an edge trailing motion. That means whatever direction I'm moving in, the edge is the back of that motion. So edge trailing, edge leading, edge leading, edge trailing. It's an edge trailing motion. And we're going to do that at the same angle that we sharpened at, alternating sides. So we're going to go on one side and the other side, and one side and the other side. And that burr is going to get bent back and forth a whole bunch. And the bending of it back and forth a whole bunch weakens its connection to the edge. And bit by bit, as we do that, we're also going to be grinding away at it a little bit. So it's going to get smaller and smaller as we go. We're going to do that until we can't feel a burr anymore. Doesn't mean it's gone, it just means we can't feel it. And then we'll go through an additional step to get rid of it. I actually use the back of these blue non-scratch sponges for the burr removal because I always have them around and they're really effective. The blue ones specifically, the non-scratch ones, because they're just extruded woven plastic, so it's just like a plastic coarse cloth, essentially. The green ones have a lot of abrasive in them, so you don't want to use that. Some people will use wine cork or felt or their jeans, but what I'll do at the end after I've done that is I'll just kind of swipe across here a few times, and I'll go and strop one more time or two more times to make sure I haven't messed up the edge. You can cut through wine cork, and you'll feel like as you do that kind of thing, the first couple of cuts don't feel as good, and as you start to remove that burr, it will feel sharper and sharper as you go. You can do that with hard felt. You can literally take your jeans and go like this if you want. You just have to do something to make sure that you're doing a good job at burr removal. It's a really important part of getting long, lasting, consistent edges. So that is the burr removal thing. So that is the first image that we have there. Yeah, cool. All right, so the second image. Over time, as we sharpen, this looks like a transformer symbol. Over time, as we sharpen, as indicated by these kind of red lines on this image that you have in front of you, you'll see that the knife gets thicker and thicker behind the edge. So if you measure the distance like here from one side to the other, and then here from one side to the other, and here from one side, it gets larger and larger. And so as we sharpen, we're moving up the blade into thicker and thicker sections. And that means that the knife being thicker behind the edge will not cut as well. The thicker it is, the more it has to displace material, and the sooner that thickness occurs, the sooner that displacement occurs. So that's why your knife might like wedge in foods after you've sharpened it for a long time, or it doesn't feel as sharp as you go through stuff, or may not stay sharp quite as long. So as this happens over time, we have to actually regain control over our cross-sectional geometry. And the way that we do that is what's called thinning behind the edge. So if you see the red line here as like the angle we had sharpened it, the green line is significantly more acute. It's a much lower angle. And in doing so, we're removing metal from the sides of the blade, not necessarily the edge, but the sides of the blade, recreating a thinness that's more similar to the cross-sectional geometry of when the knife was new, or whatever it is that you want to enact in that way. And so that will allow you then to have control over how your knife is going to perform when you cut tall, dense foods. In a perfect world, you would do this every single time you sharpen, but no one's going to do that because it's very time-consuming. It scratches up the side of your knife. It's a big pain in the ass. And so in reality, going to the next image here. I've got to do new images. But in reality, what you're going to do is every few times you sharpen, when you start to notice that it's not performing the way you want, you're gonna thin behind the edge. And so as you do that, you'll do like this upper section from like 1 to 2, recreating a thin cross-sectional geometry. And when you're done, then you do the actual edge itself. And so that's the goal that you have. If you continue to sharpen just like this and you go up the blade as you go, the knife is going to get thicker and thicker, and it's just not going to cut well anymore. So I'm sure everyone here has used a knife for a long time and watched it get like shittier as they cut with it. This is why, and thinning behind the edge is the thing that you can do about that to regain control over how your knife should be performing. So again, it's not that there's some specific time frame in which you need to do this, but be mindful. Pay attention to what's going on. Does your knife wedge a lot when you cut tall, dense foods? Maybe it's time to thin. Keep in mind, though, that the thinner that you go, the more fragile or brittle that knife is going to be, the less structurally stable it's going to be. So if you need a knife that you can like do really rough stuff with, like you're going to break down lobster with it all day, maybe don't thin the crap out of that knife. But if you want to cut, delicate things, or even tall, dense foods like butternut squash, sweet potatoes, thinner knives will work better. You just have to be really careful to not twist or rotate when you're doing that kind of stuff, especially actually on tall, dense foods like butternut squash and celery root. My opinion is you get the thinnest knife that you can find and move through that with the greatest of finesse. It will require the least amount of force. The knife won't wedge. The foods won't crack at the bottom. It's a better way to cut. But if you're not like a very finesse-oriented person, if you're more of a get-shit-done person in the kitchen, which exists, maybe you find a thicker knife and you rely on heft and weight to get through that stuff, just knowing that the knife is likely to wedge in those foods and the foods will likely crack at the bottom instead of cutting all the way through. You just won't have to worry about them being damaged. Make sense? All right, so on this third image over here, if you look at this top part, you'll see at the very edge here, there's this tiny little bevel over here. And this is called a koba or a micro bevel. On knives that are extremely thin and or extremely hard, that would otherwise be too brittle, using a micro bevel is a way that we can maintain thin cross-sectional geometry but increase toughness and durability. So if you want a knife that's really thin and moves through a butternut squash really easily, but also doesn't chip the second that it hits like the kind of crappy cutting boards, a micro bevel can be a really useful way to do that. And the goal is on your finishing stone to remove the last little bit of the edge, the weakest part, at a higher angle than you normally would. And it should look no bigger than like a thread or a single hair. The second you start doing more than that, you have a much more significant impact on cross-sectional geometry and the knife doesn't cut as well. This is not something you want to do on all your knives. It's something you want to do on your knives when they are extremely, extremely, extremely thin and or extremely, extremely, extremely hard and otherwise chip on you. So I don't know what kind of knives you'll have, but if you ever use like Takamura, for example, they're extremely thin and they can chip really easily. Using a micro bevel can help you alleviate some of those chipping issues while still maintaining thin cross-sectional geometry. Make sense? Cool. All right, so let's move on to the fourth image here. Looks something like this. So earlier we talked about asymmetry, and I talked about, like 50-50, roughly equal, 50-50 micro bevel. These are 70-30 where the angles are equal, 70-30 where they're not equal. Really extreme things like 99-1 or 90-10. This is the way that people have traditionally expressed those things. But now that we've discussed this, you guys understand that you don't have to be limited to these ways of doing things, and you have a better way to think about this. There are some knives that are a little bit unique. If you have Japanese boning knives, like a honesuki or hankotsu, they look a lot like this one. They're not actually single bevel in the sense they don't have like a hologram backside, but they're extremely asymmetrical. And the goal of doing that is to allow you to ride much closer to the bone with the apex of the edge when you do those things. So when you sharpen a Japanese boning knife, you'll sharpen predominantly on one side, and you just do like the buru move on the backside. If you have clad knives, like I think you have some clad knives because you responded in that way, this kind of not equal angle situation will allow you to keep the apex of the edge better centered than it would if you just adjust the amount of time that you spend on either side. But again, you don't have to rely on those ratios. You can rely on just using your knife, cutting with it, seeing what happens, and then responding to that in an intelligent way. Up here at the top, there's a few things I have going on here. One, the distance from A to B and G to H and D to E is consistent even from heel to tip. So you'll see the bevel size is the same size all the way through from the heel to the tip, and that's what you're going for. And what's really cool about that is that at the tip of the knife, if you're shooting for a consistent even bevel, you know that this distance here along the spine from E to D has to come into contact with your stone when you're sharpening the tip of the knife. Otherwise, your bevel will get smaller as you go towards the tip. That means that when you sharpen the tips of your knife, you will have to make an adjustment. And the adjustment for sharpening tips will always involve this move, lifting up a little bit and rotating towards the spine. If you do not do that, the bevel will get smaller as you go towards the tip. And that is true on either side of the knife. Lift up, rotate towards the spine. You have to do that for the bevel to stay consistent even from heel to tip. Does that make sense? Sweet. The blue line to the red line here is the minimum amount that I would want to do for thinning. So when you thin your knife and you're doing it at a much lower angle, you want to have contact with roughly like 1/5 of the knife minimum. If you have more than that, like if it contacts 1/3 or 1/2, you're going to have a much more significant impact on overall cross-sectional geometry. But if you do less than this, you're wasting your time because you're not having as much of an impact on the overall performance of your knife. So when you do that kind of stuff, you can actually see what's going on, pay attention to where the scratches are and say, like, am I enacting enough of a change in my knife for this to be a worthwhile venture, or do I need to do more? And again, the same thing here. It's consistent even from heel to tip, so the adjustment when you're doing the thinning at the tip involves lifting up and rotating towards the spine a little bit. On knives that have distal taper, so if you look at the center part here, you'll see that the knife, if you're looking along the spine, like if I look at it like this, the knife gets like thinner as it goes towards the tip. On knives with distal taper, there's a really interesting thing that happens, and let me see if I can find my image for this. Cool. So on knives with distal taper, because the tip is much thinner, if you sharpen at the same angle, the bevel will actually appear smaller. Again, I apologize for my shitty art skills, but this is like a thicker knife overlaid on like a thinner knife, and you can see they're sharpened at the same angle, and the thinner knife has a much smaller apparent bevel than the thicker knife, right? And so assuming that you maintain a consistent angle as you go, the bevel would look smaller. But in fact, when we sharpen, our goal is to make sure that the bevel is even and consistent from heel to tip. You guys are all going to judge me for my shit art skills after this. In order to maintain that even and consistent bevel from heel to tip, that means we're going to have to dynamically adjust the angle a little bit as we go. And so on knives with distal taper, where it gets thinner as you go towards the tip will be a little bit more acute and the heel will be a little bit less acute. And something really cool happens with that. It means that for knives like that, the tip also being more acute is going to be a little bit sharper feeling, a little bit more finesse oriented. So when you want to do finesse oriented shit with your knife, like, I don't know, maybe a shallot or something like that, the tip is going to work really well for that. And the heel being slightly less acute means that it's going to be better to deal with more tough and durable stuff. So if you want to, take the head off of a small fish or cut through the spine of a chicken or something like that, the heel being a little bit less acute will be a little bit more tough and durable. And so you end up with this kind of like more versatile blade as you work with those knives with distal taper. And so that is what we try and show on that image there. On the last image that we have, this is the Sharpie sheet. And so that looks like this. Sharpie is the shit. Everyone has a Sharpie on them because you work in a kitchen. And you can use that for sharpening too. And I use these big Magnum ones because they make it a little bit easier. The goal is to color in not just the edge of your knife, but some distance behind it. Like get a good like 1/2 inch of marker on there. And so if you look at the top image on this sheet, you'll see that the side of the knife is colored in. What's really cool about this is that there are 7 mistakes that you can make when you're sharpening, and 6 of them you can see, and 1 of them you can feel. The one you can feel is an inconsistent or uneven burr formation, and I'll touch on that in a second, but we talked about burr formations earlier, and we want to make sure it's consistent even from heel to tip. We can feel for that. The 6 that you can see are angle too high, angle too low, not lifting it up enough, lifting up too much, under rotation and over rotation. And they all show up in really distinct patterns with Sharpie. And so all of a sudden, if you color in the side of your knife, you can see what your mistake is, and then you know what to do about it. So for example, in the top one here, this is angle too high. That means, so this is the second image. That means the spine of the knife is too high relative to the stone. And when I see that, the bevel is going to have Sharpie removed right at the very edge, but not for the entire height of the bevel. And that's an indicator that my angle is too high, so the spine is too high, so I lower that shit. Pretty straightforward, right? So conversely, when your angle is too low, that means the spine of your knife is too close to the stone. The edge stays black, but the area behind it becomes shiny, right? You haven't touched the edge at all. In fact, that's what you want to see when you're thinning your knife. That's specifically what you want to see when you're thinning your knife. When you see that, lift it up a little bit. So if you have an angle too high issue, the long-term repercussion of that is your knife will become thicker behind the edge and it won't cut as well. It won't feel as sharp. If you have an angle too low issue, your knife won't get sharp because you haven't hit the edge at all, but it will become thinner cross-sectionally. So you can see those things and know, like, this is how I have to respond to them. When you don't rotate enough towards the tip, so we talked about tip adjustments being lifting up and rotating back towards the spine. So say you lift up, but you don't rotate back towards the spine enough, you'll see that the bevel decreases in size as you go towards the tip. right? And so when you see that, you know you need to rotate a little bit more. Long-term effect of that is that you start to develop a bird's beak tip at the very tip of your knife because the tip doesn't get as much play as the area behind it. So we want to avoid that as much as possible. When you rotate too much, meaning that you go too far to the spine, the bevel will increase in size dramatically as you go towards the tip. And so when you see that, you do a little bit less rotation. Long-term effect of that is that you end up with a lot more belly at the tip of your knife. So it starts to sweep up a lot more because you remove more metal in that area. When you don't lift up enough, so you rotate but you're not lifting up enough, the tip of the knife will stay black. So you miss that area entirely. And the area behind it just looks like you started to scratch the side of the knife because all you're doing is lowering the angle as you go. The long-term effect of that is also a bird's beak or like a little curve in your blade. It's just a little bit further back from the tip. And again, your tip will not get sharp. And when you lift up too much, so you come up too high like this, the tip just gets ground away. You end up with like a rounded over tip. It's actually really difficult to see in Sharpie because you'll have removed all the Sharpie, but what you can do is you can look at the edge and you can see this should look like a plane, the bevel all the way through. And when you get to the top, if it starts to look like this and you see light reflect up and over it that way, that's usually a sign that you've lifted up a little bit too much. But also, you'll just see the tip gone and then you know you fucked that up. When your tip is gone like this, you want to repair it in the same way that you would with any broken tip. So instead of fixing it from the edge this way, like grinding it all the way through, you want to grab the coarsest stone that you can or some sandpaper or the sidewalk, and you're going to grind down from the spine. And so you'll grind all the way along the spine here, reshaping it until you have the kind of point that you want again. And that way you don't mess with cross-sectional geometry. It doesn't become thicker behind the edge. The profile of your knife stays the same. You just get a point back. And so anytime you have to deal with tip repairs, that's the way to do it. Also works well for that. When you've done a good job sharpening, you're going to have the Sharpie removed consistently and evenly all the way across the edge, as we show in the very last image there. And so that's the goal of sharpening. All right? All right, so now I'm going to try and get through this stuff really quickly and show you what each of those things looks like, and then try and get through the mistakes, and hopefully we'll get this wrapped up. So here we go. I'm going to start with a medium grit stone today. So I got my medium grit stone here. It's been soaking in the water. I got my knife. So I got it clamped down here. I sharpen it a decline this way. You can sharpen flat, doesn't matter. But the decline is cool because water goes that way when I splash it on top. And as I move further away from myself, my wrist doesn't have as much of a tendency to tilt back. When you sharpen flat and you move further away, your wrist will tilt back a little bit. So it's a little bit more difficult to maintain an angle consistently. But you don't have to do it this way. This is just the way that I do stuff. So pinch grip, index finger to the spine, thumb down towards the heel. Body positioning looks good. Make sure my stone is wet. I'm going to splash water on it periodically as I go. Anytime the stone starts to sound scratchy, put more water on it. I'm going to put the knife down, and I'm going to use the heel of the knife and the edge of the stone as a reference point. So I know if I'm starting 1 centimeter in from the edge, as I move forward, I'm still 1 centimeter from the edge, and as I move back, I'm still 1 centimeter from the edge. 2 to 3 fingers tightly grouped, and I'm going to start moving forward and backward like this. And then I'm going to crawl them up the blade, or I'm going to stop, move them, and keep going. All right? I'm going to do this as I go all the way up the blade, maintaining consistent angle. This hand stays over the center line of the stone. I'm not applying a lot of pressure. It's not about strength. It's about consistency. As I get towards the tip, I have to make that adjustment, lifting up and rotating back towards the spine. And there are a few ways you can do that. One, you can do this kind of motion, kind of breaking your wrist as you go out, lifting up and rotating back towards the spine. You can always stop here at the top and check, did I lift up and rotate enough? Where do I stand? I prefer this method where I tuck in, and then I use this slight wrist rotation here to do that same motion. But you can hear there's a swishing sound as I drop down, and it sounds different from this, right? This sounds different from that, right? I want to make sure I have that latter sound, and the reason is I'm dropping all the way back down and connecting the tip to the rest of the blade so I don't end up with like a separate tip sharpening thing and then the rest of the blade being sharpened differently. So I'm going to sharpen that way until I form a burr that's even and consistent. I'm going to pass this around so you guys can feel that. And the way that I want you to feel for a burr is this. You're going to hold the knife in your dominant hand. You're going to place your thumb on the side that you sharpened, and you're going to run these fingers up along the side of the blade this way. Not over the edge, sure as hell not towards the edge, not laterally at all, just up this way. And the reason that we want to do it this way is we're going to use our index finger and middle finger, and they are significantly more sensitive than your thumb. So you'll be able to feel the burr much easier, and you'll be able to gauge size of it much easier. So I'm going to pass this around for you guys to be able to feel that, and let me get a towel for you also so your hands aren't wet when you do that. While that's going on, let me continue sharpening a different knife so we can get through this. So once I've done the one side, I'm going to start again from the pinch grip. I'm going to move my thumb up to the spine and my index finger down towards the heel, and I'm going to do the second side. My angle of approach here is going to be perpendicular instead of off at an angle, but as soon as I can, I'm going to transition back into that angle of approach. Now you see I tend to crawl my fingers up as I go, but if you don't feel comfortable with that, do a little bit, stop, move your fingers, do a little bit, stop, move your fingers. You don't have to count anything. Why? Because you're going to feel for the burr. If it's not even and consistent, you're going to go back and do the areas that were weak a little bit more and the areas that were strong a little bit less. So it doesn't matter if you do 10 strokes or 15 strokes or 2 strokes. Who cares? You're going to be looking at metrics that you can actually measure. And so feeling for that burr is a measurable metric as opposed to like counting stuff where stroke length or pressure can vary dramatically. So that's why we're not going to rely on counting. Make sense? So as I come up towards the tip here, I also need to make that adjustment lifting up and rotating back towards the spine, and I can do that a number of ways. I can step to the side and do this kind of like golf backswing type thing. And again, I can stop and check my work over here. Or I can do small incremental adjustments. Do you guys remember like in, I want to say like elementary school in math, you get the graph paper and you do like lines like this and it would create like a big curve. It always stuck out. I had like a really good math teacher in elementary school. But the point is that you can make curves out of a number of straight lines. And you can enact that same kind of plan here on the knife. So for example, as I come up towards the tip, I can start sharpening at the tip and say I'm sharpening in this point here. Forward, backward, and then I make the tiniest adjustment, lifting up and rotating towards the spine so that now I'm sharpening here. Forward, backward, tiny adjustment, here, forward, back. And I keep doing those like forward, backward, tiny adjustment, forward, backward, tiny adjustments as I come up towards the tip. Now the thing about that kind of like graph paper line thing is that the curves always look better when the spacing is tighter grouped. When you have like a lot of spacing, it looks really choppy like a polyhedron. But when they're tightly grouped, it starts to look much more like a curve. So as you do this kind of thing, if you choose this method, you don't want to do like here, and then here, and then here. You want to have a lot of really tiny, small adjustments as you go through to keep that curve as smooth as possible. And again, at the very top, you can stop and see, did I lift up enough? Did I rotate enough? So once you've formed a burr on both sides, and again, I'm feeling for it the same way. Dominant hand, thumb on the side I sharpen, fingers coming across the edge this way. And you all can feel that burr, right? Like it's there. It's very easy to see what's going on, and it's consistent even from heel to tip, right? You want to make sure that you're doing that every time. So once we've done that, we're going to stop and we're going to switch to our next stone. So I'm going to take, in this case, a finishing stone. You don't need like a lot of things to bridge gaps. So you don't need like 1,000, 3,000, 5,000, 8,000. One good medium grit stone, one good finishing stone. As long as they're in the ranges we talked about earlier, you should be in good shape. I'm going to go back and do the same thing that I did just on my next stone. So I'm going to start again on this side. I'm going to do it on my finishing stone like this. And as I do this, I'm still forming a burr. Ideally, it will be a little bit smaller than it was before, but I still want to make sure it's even and consistent from heel to tip. The reason I want my fingers tightly grouped and I want to move them all the way through the blade is that wherever I'm applying pressure, that's where the bulk of sharpening is taking place. So I want to make sure that I hit every place along the blade as I go. And then I'll look at the edge. Does the scratch pattern that I have look like the scratch pattern I expect from this, or does it still look like the scratch pattern I had from the previous stone? If I can see deep scratches and I want a finishing stone, I'm doing something wrong. I want to keep going until I got rid of the previous scratches. So like sandpaper, you want to make sure the previous scratches are gone before you move on. Flip the knife over, same thing again. And really not a huge amount of pressure. And in fact, if you have a kitchen scale, you can measure the amount of pressure that you're applying. You want to be, for the bulk of your sharpening, somewhere around like 500 to 1,000 grams. So with your left hand, just press on a scale, see what that feels like. For the heaviest sharpening, like coarse work, like 2,000 grams. But you don't want to be much more than that. And so if you find that you really bear down on things and you press down on that scale and it's like 10 pounds of pressure, maybe like pump the brakes on that a little bit and try and relax. Sharpening is really not going to be like a strength game. It's going to be about just being very consistent and finesse oriented as you go. All right, so now I've gone through, ideally my coarse, but in this case my medium and fine stones, and I've got this little burr hanging off the last side that I just sharpened. So I want to go through that stropping motion we talked about earlier. And so at the same angle that we sharpened at, we're going to start going all the way through. And there are a couple of ways you can do this. One is this kind of J stroke. So here I'm starting on my stone like this and coming all the way through like this. So I use this space to make sure I'm not jabbing the tip of the knife into the stone. I can also start here and come across like this. That's fine too. But the goal is that I'm maintaining the same angle that I sharpened at, and I'm covering the entire length of the blade. And then I do the other side. And again, I can start here and do that reverse J stroke. I can do this cross thing over here. I can come back this way. It doesn't really matter what I'm doing. It just matters that I'm consistent with my angle, and I do one time on one side and then one time on the other side. And the effect of this, as I mentioned before, is bending that burr back and forth, making it smaller and weaker. And I'm going to do that until I can't feel a burr anymore. And you can color in, by the way, when you're doing this with Sharpie, you can color in both sides and do this, stop, dry it off, color it in, do it again and again and again. And when you're done, just grab some acetone and like a cotton pad or a paper towel and get rid of the Sharpie, and it'll be nice and clean. Acetone is by far the easiest way to get rid of that. Do make sure that when you use Sharpie that you're coloring in pretty frequently. So like if you've done it and you've removed a bunch of Sharpie and you can't tell what's going on, stop, dry off your knife, color it in, do it again. And let the Sharpie dry before you start sharpening so it doesn't get all over the place. It's really, like, I can't explain how much of a useful thing it is. Like, just imagine if everything you cooked had like a little pop-up thing and it's like done. You're like, see you, you know, like it's that easy to be able to do things. So now I can't feel a burr anymore. It's good. So now I want to remove it. Like I said, I use the back of these sponges, and it's just as simple as doing this. If I use the cork, the way that I would do that is slicing through like this, and at some point I'll start to feel it really starts to cut through really quickly. When I'm done with that, I like to go over 1 or 2 more times. It's not necessary strictly, but if there's any damage caused by ripping that piece of metal off of the edge, I'd like to fix that. And so the goal when I'm done is to have a nice, clean, sharp edge. And there are a number of ways to test that. The best thing you can do is just go cut food, see how that shit works. Cutting paper will tell you, like, if there's little chips or nicks in the edge, you'll be able to feel them, or if it feels like different in one area than another, you haven't done a consistent job. The way that a lot of people in Japan test is on their thumbnail, and what they'll do is they'll take the knife and they'll put it against their thumbnail and they'll pull. And it should stick like tape. It doesn't want to move around there. It's not going to cut through your thumbnail, but you'll be able to feel it like dig in there, and you can check all the way along the blade. And what's cool about that is it'll tell you not just that your knife is sharp, but it also has an appropriate amount of bite for kitchen use. And the goal is you want to have some kind of tactile feedback when you cut stuff. So if you refine your edge too much, you cut like a tomato, it like falls through stuff, you can't feel what's going on. You want to get some feedback from your knife as you go, so toothiness actually matters a lot in that case. They also do this on the back of their hair. They'll try and, I don't have hair, so I can't do that, but they'll see if it digs into their hair. But that's the goal in terms of like that ultimate sharp edge. If you want to use a leather strop, those also can be effective, and you can do them with like loaded compounds like chromium oxide or just clean. You can use your jeans. You can step on a kitchen towel and hold it tight and strop on that, and you'll do that in the same way that you were doing it on the stone, same angle, something like that. And so the goal when we are done sharpening is to have something ideally that cuts well. Like that's our end goal. We've gone over all the things that I think I wanted to go over. Just making sure I didn't miss anything for y'all. I'm pretty sure that those are all the main things. I didn't color in with Sharpie. I hope that you guys will try that. Again, we have videos on all this stuff, and all of this that we're talking about here will be up for you guys to reference. Hit me up with any questions.